Hey guys, today we will talk about the life of a medieval peasant girl. Not the kind you find in fairy tales, not a lady-in-waiting or a noble daughter, but a true daughter of the soil. Her life was not inked into history books, yet every breath she took shaped the heartbeat of her village. Tonight we walk the path she walked, barefoot and brave. But before we get started, take your time to settle in and turn on that sleep timer so your screen turns off automatically as you drift into sleep. The year is 1347. A small village nestled deep in the countryside, untouched by grandeur, unseen by kings. The air smells of earth, ash, and livestock. The wind carries the sound of distant bleating sheep and the soft thud of footsteps on wet soil. Here lives a girl. She is 20 years old. In your world, she would be considered young, barely past her teens. But in hers, she is a woman fully formed by struggle, by endurance, by the cruel rhythm of the seasons. You might expect her to be named in some old parish record, but she's not. Her name was whispered in the kitchen, shouted in the fields, sung by her mother when she was a baby, but it was never written down. And so, in history, she disappeared, as if she never existed. But she did. She was born into a hut made of wattle and daub, a small skeletal structure patched with mud and straw. The roof was thatched, the floor was earth. There was no bed, only straw stuffed into sacks. Rats scurried between the walls. The hearth was the heart of the home, not just for warmth but for cooking, lighting, and living. Smoke lingered in the air constantly, not like the comforting smell of a fireplace, but a sharp sting in the eyes, a heavy blanket on the lungs. From the day she could walk, she worked. By 5 years old, she was carrying water. By 7, she was tending goats. By 10, she could skin a rabbit, milk a cow, spin yarn, and silence a crying sibling with one firm touch. No toys. No time for idle wonder. Each morning, she rose before the light touched the fields. Her fingers, numbed by the cold, laced up her woolen dress, coarse, dull brown, sometimes patched, sometimes damp. She didn't choose her outfit. She had one. That was it. She stepped outside, greeted by fog and silence. There were no paved paths. Only mud. Mud that clung to her feet, squelched between her toes, hardened into crusts. She walked to the stream, half a mile away. Not because she wanted a morning stroll, but because water had to be fetched, and no one else would do it. Her hands, rough as bark, were not a flaw, they were her tools. Her nails were always chipped, her wrists bore the grooves of baskets carried day after day. Her back ached constantly, her knees cracked when she squatted, and she did not remember a time when she didn't feel tired. But you see, her village was her world. All of it. She didn't know what lay beyond the forest. She had never seen a town. She had heard of the king, yes, but to her, the king was like the moon, far away, bright, unreachable. She lived surrounded by people who were just like her. Men who toiled in the fields. Women who carried children on their backs while grinding grain with their hands. Old folks with stories that didn't always make sense but were always listened to. Babies born into cries, and sometimes silence. In that world, her body was not her own. It belonged to the land, to the work, to the family. And yet, and this is important, she was not sad. Not always. You might think, how could she be anything but miserable? But that's the strange and beautiful thing about life. It finds light even in darkness. It breathes, even in the tightest places. She knew what joy felt like. When bread rose perfectly. When her brother made a joke that made her laugh so hard her ribs hurt. When a neighbor offered honeycomb from their own hive. when the stars were so bright and clear that the sky didn't seem like something above her, but something with her. She didn't dream of riches. She didn't even know what gold looked like. She dreamed of ease, of one morning where she didn't have to rise before dawn, of one winter where the fire didn't go out before sunrise, of one day where her belly felt full from something other than barley or turnip stew. But life had made her tough, not by choice, but by necessity. And that toughness, that silent, unspoken strength, was something few ever saw. No one wrote songs about her. No bard passed through to ask her story. No painter etched her into stone. But she was the story. She was the reason the village kept going. She carried its future on her back, in her hands, in her womb, in her will. And yet, if she walked past you today, in your dream, in your vision, you might miss her. Because the world taught us to look up, to crowns, to jewels, to bright colors. But the real heart of history? It walked with bare feet. It smelled of smoke and soil. And it wore no crown but the sky. Her body was her burden and her tool. At just 20, her skin had already begun to wear the story of her life. Not in ink, not in symbols, but in calluses, cracks, and the way her spine curved slightly from bending too much, too early. You might imagine someone this young as vibrant, glowing, graceful, but her glow was not from health, it was from sweat. Her grace came not from posture, but from balance, the balance of carrying heavy buckets without spilling, of shifting weight while digging in fields, of knowing how to hold a child on one hip and a sack of grain on the other without toppling over. She was strong, but not by choice. She never had the luxury of thinking about her body the way we do today. No mirrors, no grooming rituals, no quiet moments of self-reflection. Her body was not an aesthetic. It was a machine, one that had to keep going, no matter how tired it was. One that no one else would take care of. She bled without rest when her cycle came. No soft cloths, no privacy. Only rags she had to wash herself, in the same stream she fetched water from. Sometimes she worked through cramps so painful that her vision blurred. But no one paused for her pain. It was just a part of life. She smelled of earth, of smoke, of sweat. She didn't know the scent of perfume. The only scents she knew were those of animals, onions, wild flowers crushed beneath bare feet, and damp wool. And her clothes? A single dress. Coarse. Heavy. Brown or gray or a faded shade in between. It scratched her skin in summer and soaked through in winter. If it tore, it was mended, not replaced. She wore it until it couldn't be worn anymore. On special feast days, she might borrow a second-hand apron from an older sister or neighbor. That would feel like wearing silk. Shoes? Maybe once, in deep winter, made of scraps of leather wrapped with string. But most of the time, she walked barefoot. Not because it was freeing, but because it was normal. Her feet had grown hard, used to the stones, the thorns, the frozen ground. You might when stepping on gravel, she didn't even notice. Food was not a choice. There was no breakfast menu, no midday snacks. Just survival. Barley bread. Turnips. On good days, eggs. On rare days, a piece of salted meat. She ate what was available, not what she liked. The bread was rough, sometimes burnt, often stale. The stew was thin. But it was food, and in her world food was precious. She knew hunger. Not skipping a meal hunger. Not, I'll eat later, hunger. But deep, hollow hunger. The kind that makes your bones feel light and your legs wobble. The kind that makes you fall asleep just to escape it. Every chore she did required her full strength. Washing clothes wasn't just dipping them in water. It meant hauling heavy buckets, scrubbing against rocks, wringing out wool with freezing hands until her knuckles cracked. Cooking meant gathering wood, starting a fire from almost nothing, preparing everything from scratch, often while looking after younger siblings or an elder too weak to work. She couldn't take breaks. There was no such thing. If she stopped, the work waited, more stubborn than any taskmaster. And yet, despite all this, she cared. About the little things. She took pride in her bread rising just right. She hummed to herself while spinning wool, even if her fingers bled. She whispered lullabies to a baby who wasn't even hers, just because the crying hurt her heart. Her hands, twisted and stained with the earth, were full of kindness. She wasn't just surviving, she was holding her world together. If someone got sick, she was the first to gather herbs or warm water. If the goat broke loose, she was the one to chase it down. If a child fell, she'd lift them, even if her own arms were shaking. Her labor was not just physical, it was emotional. She carried not just sacks of grain, but everyone's expectations. She was expected to endure. Expected to know things without being taught. Expected to comfort, to feed, to stitch, to serve, and expected never to complain. And so she didn't. She held her tongue when the work hurt too much. She bit her lip when her father barked orders, even though she had been working all day too. She laughed softly when the others laughed, even if her heart was elsewhere. But inside her, a quiet rebellion stirred. She dreamed of soft things, of soft beds, soft voices, soft days. She didn't want luxury. She just wanted rest. Not forever. Just long enough to remember what rest felt like. She wondered what it was like to wake up to birdsong, and not a baby's cry. To eat when she was hungry, not when the chores were done. To wear something that didn't itch. To walk outside and breathe without rushing. But these were fantasies. And so, she pressed her hands into the earth again. She scrubbed. She gathered. She cooked. She cleaned. She mended. She lifted. She carried. She endured. Not because she chose this life, but because this life chose her. And in the eyes of others, she may have been invisible. But not to us. Not tonight. Tonight you see her. You walk beside her. You feel the weight on her shoulders and the strength in her steps. And as your eyes begin to close, her story begins to rise, not as a whisper, but as a song. By day, her hands told the story of her life, hard, tired, weathered. But by night, her heart whispered truths no one ever asked to hear. You see, no one in her world asked a peasant girl what she thought. No one asked her what made her sad, what made her smile. She existed in service to others, to her family, her land, her village. But inside, she was a world of thoughts, of wonder, of quiet rebellion that dared not bloom aloud. She often sat alone once the children were asleep, once the stew had cooled, once the fire had burned low. In that silence, she breathed like she belonged to herself again. Just for a few moments. Not as a daughter. Not as a worker. Not as a pair of hands. But as a soul, aching, hoping, still alive. You might think she was just a peasant. What could she possibly dream of? But that is not true. She dreamed more because she had less. When her body ached, she dreamed of floating in a river where the water was warm and gentle, and nothing was asked of her. When her voice had gone unheard all day, she dreamed of singing, freely, without shame. Not to perform, but just to feel what it's like to be loud, to exist fully, to echo. She dreamed of love, not in the fairy tale sense, not a knight galloping on a white horse, no. Her love was quieter, deeper. She dreamed of being seen, being spoken to softly, having her hair tucked behind her ear by someone who didn't see her calluses and turn away. Someone who saw her pain and didn't flinch. Sometimes she'd let herself imagine a world where she didn't have to marry for function, where she could choose. Where love was not a transaction of labor and cattle, but a connection that warmed her even on the coldest days. But she was afraid too. She was afraid of becoming her mother, bent, broken, used up. She was afraid of childbirth, of losing her life in the moment that should have given it. She had seen women scream and bleed and never return from that straw-covered floor. She feared disease, famine, fire. But more than anything, she feared disappearing. Not dying, no, she had made peace with death. But disappearing. Being forgotten. Like she had never been here at all. And yet, even within all that fear, she had hope. It showed in the way she taught the little ones to sing while they worked. In the way she saved the last crumb of honey for her younger brother. In the way she placed wildflowers in the window, even when no one noticed. In the way she whispered prayers, not because she was told to, but because she wanted to believe that someone out there was listening. Sometimes, her hope came in the form of rebellion, small, silent, and secret. Like stopping to look at the stars when everyone else was too tired to care. Like humming a tune from her childhood when the fields were quiet. Like burying a dried flower under a tree and calling it her secret. Those things, they were hers. You may wonder, could she read? No. Could she write? No. But she remembered everything. Her memory was her library. Songs, faces, the scent of spring, the time her father once smiled at her in a way he never did again. These things lived inside her. And in that, she was rich. She might not have owned land, or gold, or silks. But she had a heart that kept beating, even when no one cared if it did. She had stories, not the kind written in books, but the kind that shaped people. Stories of resilience, sacrifice, warmth, and grit. Stories that pulsed through generations like underground rivers, unseen but essential. She had value, not because of what she owned, but because of what she carried within. And now, centuries later, when the world has changed so much that her life feels like a distant echo, we remember her. Not as a nameless worker, not as a figure in the background, but as a woman who lived fully, fiercely, gently, all at once. She is no longer silent. You hear her now. She is with you now, in the flicker of firelight in your mind, in the whisper of sleep curling around you. Let her story keep you company tonight. Let it settle around you like a blanket made of earth and stars. Let it remind you that every soul matters, even the ones the world forgot. And maybe, just maybe, you'll dream of her too. Close your eyes. Now imagine home, not the one you know, but the only one she ever had. Not made of stone, nor decorated with lace. Not filled with sunlight or songs or color. Her home was a dark, low-roofed hut made of mud, straw, and wood. It leaned slightly to the left, as if tired from standing too long, just like the people inside it. This was where she was born, where she worked, where she dreamed, where she would likely die. It wasn't just small, it was cramped. One single room for the entire family. Her parents, her siblings, possibly a cousin, or an aging grandparent too frail to work. All of them under the same fragile roof. And it was always the same, no space for secrets, no room for silence. Every cough, every cry, Every whispered prayer was heard by everyone. There were no walls to hide behind. Just corners, dim and quiet, but never truly private. Her bed wasn't a bed at all. It was a sack of straw, thin and lumpy, laid out in a spot that was slightly drier than the rest. Sometimes she shared it with a sibling. Sometimes she slept curled beside the fire, chasing a little warmth before dawn pulled her back to the fields. And the floor? Not stone. Not wood. It was earth. Dirt that shifted after rain. Dirt that dried and cracked in summer. Dirt that they walked on, sat on, sometimes even bled on. When she woke up, the first thing she felt beneath her hands wasn't a soft sheet, it was soil. Sometimes scattered with straw. Sometimes not. She didn't know anything else. Above her, the roof groaned with every gust of wind. Made from thatch, bundled reeds tied together with hope, it kept most of the rain out. Not all. When the storm came hard and loud, it leaked. Small cold droplets landed on her neck while she tried to sleep. She moved over, tucked herself tighter, and waited for it to stop. Their only fire burned in a pit of stones set low to the ground. There was no chimney, just a small hole above to let the smoke drift out, and most of the time, it didn't. Smoke curled around their heads, stinging their eyes, clogging their throats, blackening the beams above. The smell never left her clothes, her hair, or her skin. It was the scent of her life. And yet, she kept it burning. Every morning, even in winter, when her fingers were too numb to tie a knot, she knelt before the ashes and breathed life into them. She struck the flint, fed it twigs, then logs, then dung. Her reward was warmth, barely enough to fight the cold, but enough to feel real, for a few sacred moments. At night, they slept close. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. She could feel her little brother's breath on her arm, her mother's hand resting unconsciously on her ankle. It wasn't comfortable, it was necessary. Their body heat was the only thing between them and the freeze that crept in through the corners. There were no candles, only firelight. No tables, only a wooden slab balanced on barrels. No chairs, just crates or the ground. Every object in that hut had a purpose. No decoration. No indulgence. A pot for cooking. A basket for grain. A hook for tools. If something broke, they fixed it, not because they liked it, but because they had nothing else. You might wonder, did she hate it? Did she ever cry just from the weight of being packed so tightly, day after day? Yes. Sometimes, when no one could see, she did cry. Not because the space was small, but because the world had decided it was all she would ever know. And yet, that same space that trapped her also kept her alive. She knew every sound that home made. The way the door creaked when it opened. The way the wind whistled through the beams during storms. The pop of wood in the fire, the rustle of straw underfoot, the soft murmur of her father's voice telling a story, again, even though they had all heard it. She found comfort in that sameness, in the predictability, in the routine, because the world outside the hut was hard, cruel. Inside, at least, she understood the rules. She didn't have a mirror. She barely knew what she looked like. But she knew how her sister's eyes widened when she laughed. She knew how to tell when her mother was angry, even if her voice stayed calm. She knew how her father's hands looked by firelight, old and cracked and full of history. That tiny space, no bigger than a garden shed, was everything she had. And she protected it, loved it, even when it failed her. Because home was not a place she could walk away from. It was her past, It was her present, and it was her only future. And though she sometimes dreamed of walls that didn't weep with rain, or a bed that didn't ache with straw, she also dreamed of keeping her family close. Always. Because even in the cold, even in the dark, even in hunger, there was warmth, not from the fire, but from each other. Her home changed with the sky. It was made of wood and straw, earth and thread, held together more by faith than by strength. And though it never grew in size, it moved with the seasons. With every shift in weather, the hut became a different place. Not better, not worse, just different. It breathed in the summer. It clenched in the winter. The roof was everything. When it held, they were safe. When it failed, they were vulnerable. In spring, it was cautious hope. Rain came often, gentle, then sudden, then soft again. The thatch would hold at first, then drip. She knew exactly where the drips would land. One over the fire pit. One at the edge of her sleeping straw. Another near the wall where the wooden frame had begun to bend. She placed bowls under them. Not because it solved the problem, but because it gave her time. Time to sleep without cold water finding her neck. Time to cook without ash turning to sludge. She'd patch what she could. Tie fresh reeds with twine. Tuck new straw into old gaps. She'd climb with bare feet onto slippery rafters, feeling the wind tug at her braid, praying the roof would forgive another year of storms. Summer brought heat, and with it, a different kind of discomfort. The roof, so good at holding in warmth, now trapped it. The air inside thickened. The walls radiated heat. The smell of sweat, smoke, and damp straw clung to everything. There was no breeze, no relief. She tied her dress higher, splashed her face from the water bucket more often, sat near the door in the evenings, just to feel the air touch her skin. Even the nights gave no mercy. She'd lay on her back, staring into the dark, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. Outside, the days were bright and long, but inside, the hut was dim, quiet, and heavy. Even joy moved slowly in summer. Then autumn would arrive with its whispers of dying leaves and cool mornings. This was her favorite time. The sun didn't burn anymore. The wind softened. And the world felt like it was sighing after holding its breath all summer. The hut smelled different in autumn, of drying herbs, stored onions, smoke curling from the hearth, and longer ribbons. She helped her mother stuff wool into the cracks in the wall. They moved straw around the doorframe, tightened the roof with layers of reeds. Every step was preparation. Every chore, a quiet fight against what was coming. Because winter was the test. In winter, the roof creaked every night. The wind searched for gaps like a thief. Frost clung to the walls. Sometimes she woke with ice on the inside of the hut, tracing pale crystals where breath had frozen. The fire was no longer a comfort, it was a lifeline. Keeping it burning was her task, her duty, her weight. Sometimes she stayed awake longer than anyone, feeding twigs into the flames, watching the red coals shift and breathe like a sleeping animal. When snow fell, the roof sagged beneath its weight. She'd hear it groan, the timbers flexing just above her head. The thought of collapse lingered in her mind, but she never said it out loud. Instead, she whispered prayers, not to saints or spirits, just to the roof itself, as if it could hear her. She hated the cold, not because it hurt, but because it made everything harder. Her hands stiffened, her breath caught, her work slowed. Even speaking was harder. And still, The days did not stop asking for her strength. But the roof. That thin, patched, weather-beaten cover above her was a symbol, not of safety, but of endurance. It reminded her that nothing had to be perfect to protect. Nothing had to be pretty to matter. It was ugly, sagging, blackened with years of smoke and soot. But it had shielded her through 20 winters. It had watched her grow from a swaddled infant to a girl who could climb up there herself. It had let light in and kept most of the dark out. It had failed her sometimes, yes, but mostly it had held on. And when she lay down at night, stiff with fatigue, face still smudged with soot, she looked up at it, that roof she patched every year with her own hands, and she felt something strange. Pride. Not in how it looked, not in how well it worked, but in the fact that it was still there, just like her. In the heart of that tiny, weather-beaten hut, there were no doors to close, no locks to turn, no space to storm off to when emotions boiled over. Privacy was a luxury, and in her world, luxuries didn't exist. She grew up with bodies always near her, breathing beside her, snoring, crying, whispering, shifting in sleep. Every inch of the home was filled with sound, with life, with obligation. If someone sneezed, everyone heard it. If someone wept silently in the dark, everyone felt it, even if they said nothing. But don't mistake that closeness for comfort. It was not always soft. Living so close, so constantly, meant living with everything, the beautiful, the brutal, and the in-between. There were moments of tenderness, yes. Her mother brushing a lock of hair from her face. Her father setting aside a warm piece of bread when there wasn't enough. But there were also moments of tension, raised voices, frustration. Silent treatments that could last hours even in a space too small to escape. Yet despite the weight of it, she would not have called it lonely. In fact, she might not even have understood the word, lonely, not in the way we mean it today. How could she, when someone was always there? Her sister's elbow in her side as they slept. Her brother's foot accidentally kicking hers in the dark. Her grandmother's breath rasping in the stillness. She was never alone. And that constant presence did something to her heart. It taught her empathy, not the kind you read about, but the kind you feel in your skin. She knew when her mother was hiding pain behind a smile. She could see her father's quiet exhaustion just by how he sat, how his shoulders slumped lower after a bad harvest. She could feel when her little brother was about to cry, not because of what he said, but by the way he gripped the hem of her dress just a little too tightly. The hut taught her how to listen. Not just with ears, but with eyes. With instinct. Arguments happened often. Tempers were short when food was scarce and the cold unrelenting. But in that space, no one stayed angry for long. They couldn't afford to. There was nowhere to flee to, no silence to hide in. Problems had to be solved in real time, hearts patched as quickly as straw in a leaking roof. And slowly, that space taught her how to forgive. She forgave her father for his hard words after a long day in the fields. She forgave her mother for not holding her longer when she cried, because she knew her mother was holding everything else. She forgave her siblings for being loud, for fighting, for needing more than she had to give, because they were children, just like she had been once, not so long ago. And somewhere in all of that noise and heat and human breath was love. Not the kind we talk about in stories, no grand gestures or proclamations. No slow dancing, no candlelight. Her love was quiet, gritty, real. It was in splitting her food when she wasn't full. in warming her brother's feet with her own, in staying awake to stir the fire while others slept, in brushing lice from her sister's hair even though her fingers ached. They didn't say, "I love you," in her world, but they showed it in ways that were harder, deeper, more enduring. And perhaps the strangest, most beautiful truth, that tight, smoky, freezing hut, it made her feel safe. Because in that one-room home, filled with coughs and closeness and the scent of onions boiling in a pot, she knew where everyone was. She knew they were breathing. She could reach out and touch them if the nightmares came. Even in hunger they shared. Even in pain they endured together. And that is a kind of warmth no fire can give. So when you picture her at night, don't just see the rough bed or the dark walls. See her curled in a blanket, her sister's hand loosely wrapped around hers, the sound of her mother's humming in the distance, the soft crackle of firelight painting gold on the walls. And feel it, that quiet pulse of togetherness, of survival made sacred, of a life lived fully even when the world called it small. Because in the end, her home was never the walls. Her home was the people. Before the light touched the trees, before the birds began their morning songs, before even the first rooster stirred, she was awake. Not because she wanted to be, not because she had finished sleeping, but because her life didn't wait. The day called to her before she opened her eyes, with a kind of weight that pressed against her chest the moment her dreams slipped away. She rose slowly, quietly, the hut still dark. Her fingers were stiff from cold, her feet heavy with yesterday's ache. She moved without sound so the others could sleep just a little longer, just until the water was fetched and the fire was burning. The morning was always cold. Even in summer, there was a sharpness in the air, dew on the grass, mist hovering like a ghost over the fields. In winter, it was worse. Her breath fogged before her. Her skin prickled. The sky was a deep gray blue, holding back light like a secret. She stepped outside, bucket in hand, and walked the same path she had walked since she could carry one. The ground was never smooth. Stones bit into her heels. Her bare feet didn't complain anymore. They had long since learned. Every step was memory. She could find that stream blindfolded, and often she nearly did, eyes still half shut with sleep. When she reached the water, she paused. Just for a second. To breathe. To watch the ripple of current. To listen to a world not yet awake. Then she dipped the bucket, lifting with both hands, arms trembling slightly with the cold. The walk back was slower, the water heavier now, and the fire inside her body not yet lit. She entered the hut again, and the world began to stir. She placed the bucket beside the hearth, fed the coals, blew gently, again and again, until flame caught. The day had officially begun. There was no time to pause, no time to savor warmth or rest. The water had to be warmed for washing. The children's feet needed wiping. The goats were waiting, stamping, braying, hungry. She knew them all by name, those animals. Knew which ones kicked, which ones leaned into her shoulder, which ones let her hum to them while she milked. It was strange, sometimes, how the animals listened better than the people. By now, the hut was alive. The baby crying, her mother slicing bread, her father gathering tools, her siblings arguing, playing, getting underfoot. She never once sat to eat her own breakfast. Not fully. Just a crust of bread in her hand while she stirred the pot. Just a sip of milk while she fastened her apron. And then, to the fields. the real work. Because everything before that was just a prelude. The field didn't care that she was tired. It didn't care if she hadn't slept well. Didn't care if her hands were blistered. Didn't care if her back burned from the day before. The soil just waited, silent, demanding. And so she answered, like she always did. She walked to the fields with the other women, shoulders already slouched forward, feet already muddy. The morning mist was lifting, the sky brightening, and the tools, crude, worn down, splintering at the handles, were passed out like extensions of their bodies. She didn't get to choose her task. She didn't get to say, "I'm too sore today," or "I did more yesterday." There was no fairness. Only rhythm. Only necessity. Dig. Plant. Pull. Lift. Repeat. It sounds simple in words, but every movement chipped away at her body. Not in grand, dramatic pain, but in slow, grinding exhaustion that never truly ended. Her arms were stronger than they looked, but they still shook. Her fingers gripped tightly, but they bled. Her knees ached as she crouched, stood, crouched again, hundreds of times before the sun reached its peak. The sun became her clock. Not a helpful, gentle one, but a cruel one. She could feel it rise in her bones, and the way sweat started behind her ears, rolled down her back, soaked into the fabric at her chest. Her dress clung to her skin like a second layer of mud. There was no shade. Sometimes she wrapped a cloth around her head. Sometimes she didn't bother. It didn't matter. The heat still found her. The wind still dried her lips until they cracked. Her mouth was often dry, her breath shallow, her throat raw from dust. And the work was never silent. There were grunts, murmurs, the creak of wooden yokes on oxen, children calling to their mothers, a distant dog barking, the occasional complaint muttered under someone's breath, quickly silenced by the weight of knowing no one could stop. Still, amid the drudgery, something strange existed. Moments when she'd pause just long enough to stretch her back and catch a glimpse of the sky, a color so blue, it almost looked like magic. Moments when a friend beside her whispered something absurd, and they both stifled laughter through chapped lips and dirt-streaked cheeks. Moments when she saw something tiny, a beetle crawling across a stone, a bird balancing on a fence post, and her world became, for one instant, quiet, gentle. But those moments were like smoke. There, then gone. And the work pulled her back. By midday, her arms were jelly. Her dress was soaked. Her knees were stained brown. And yet she kept going. Not because she had a choice, but because the rhythm of the work had become her heartbeat. In her world, to stop was not just laziness, it was danger. Stopping meant delay. Delay meant hunger. Hunger meant sickness. Sickness meant death. She didn't work because she was strong. She became strong because she worked. And still, no one praised her for it. No medals. No titles. No, "Well done." Just more work. And the occasional nod from someone who also knew what it meant to endure in silence. Her strength was invisible to the world, but to her, it was the only thing she had that no one could take. And so, as the sun sank and the shadows grew long across the fields, she lifted her head. The day had not beaten her. Not fully. She walked home with a limp, with cracked lips, with straw in her hair, and yet with pride too. Quiet, wordless pride. Because once again, She had done what was needed. She had bent, but not broken. She had given everything, and somehow kept something for herself. Tomorrow, she would do it again. But tonight, she would cook. She would sew. She would laugh, if she had the energy. She would love, in small ways. And she would sleep, if the fire burned right. If the children didn't cry. If the roof didn't leak. She would sleep. And that would be enough. The sun dipped behind the trees. Not quickly, not suddenly, but with a slow golden stretch across the sky, like a farewell that wasn't quite ready to leave. And as the shadows grew longer, her work did not end. It only changed. She came home not to rest, but to shift gears. The hut, though tiny, buzzed with needs. Water had to be brought again. The fire stirred. Pots scrubbed. Vegetables chopped with dull knives. Bread kneaded, sometimes from flour so coarse it scratched her knuckles. Her legs were tired. Her shoulders sagged. But the rhythm of the evening was familiar, almost gentle, compared to the violence of fieldwork. The warm scent of onions crackling in fat. The sound of fabric tearing as her sister mended a dress. A child's whimper. A mother's hush. There was something different about the air inside during these hours. It felt, not lighter exactly, but warmer. Not the heat from the fire, but from each other. They worked side by side. She and her sisters, or her mother, or even a neighbor who came to share news, or warmth, or just the company of women who knew what it meant to be weary. They didn't talk about dreams. Not openly. But they joked. They teased. They poked fun at each other's stitching. Laughed at the way someone had tripped earlier. Pretended not to see how the neighbor boy had smiled at her in the fields. And when that laughter came, it came like rain after drought. Not the polite kind, but the full-body kind. The kind that made her eyes water, her ribs ache, her body forget, for just a few minutes, that it had bent beneath the weight of a world that rarely said thank you. They laughed in whispers. They laughed with hands over mouths, so the baby wouldn't wake. They laughed not because life was funny, but because it wasn't. And that laughter, it was rebellion. A fire of its own, burning low and strong inside them. After dinner, after mending, after the chores gave her permission to pause, she would sometimes sit at the threshold of the hut, her feet on the earth, her back against the wooden frame, looking out at a sky that now held stars instead of clouds. Her thoughts wandered then, to questions she didn't say aloud. Will this always be my life? Will I always work this hard? Is there a world where I can choose something for myself? She didn't know. But what she did know was the soft comfort of her sister falling asleep beside her. The flicker of firelight dancing across her father's tired face. The smell of her mother's hands as they brushed her hair back one last time. In that hut, so small, so rough, she found her world. A world of exhaustion and routine, but also of closeness, of shared pain and shared joy, of survival together. And in those final minutes before sleep, when the air grew still and the last log cracked in the hearth, she would lie on her straw bed and feel something rare. Not happiness, not safety, not even peace, but enough. Enough to breathe, enough to dream, enough to begin again when the sun called her name tomorrow. And as her eyes drifted closed, with laughter still echoing in the shadows, and the warmth of love stretched out beside her like a second skin, she would whisper to the night, "Let tomorrow be kind." Her hunger began before she opened her eyes. It wasn't the sharp pain kind. Not dramatic. Not loud. But a dull, constant ache, like something missing that her body had learned to live without. And yet, she was grateful when there was bread. Barley bread, coarse, heavy, rough on the tongue. It didn't rise much, didn't smell sweet. There was no yeast, no oil, no sugar. Just barley, ground roughly by hand, sometimes with bits of husk still inside, mixed with water and maybe a pinch of salt if they were lucky. She had to work the dough herself. Her fingers, already sore, kneaded and pressed until it stopped sticking. Then, she placed it near the fire. Not in an oven, there was none, but on a hot flat stone, flipped once, like a ritual she had known since childhood. That bread wasn't a treat. It was survival. It filled the stomach just enough to silence the worst of the hunger. It didn't satisfy, but it quieted. And in her world, that was all that could be asked of food. Lunch and dinner, if they happened, meant pottage. A stew of sorts. But don't picture something rich or hearty. This was often little more than boiled water with barley or oats. Maybe onions, if they had them. Maybe herbs from the garden. If luck smiled, a carrot or two. Most days, it was watery, gray, and thin. Still, it was warm. And warmth in her world mattered. She ate slowly. Not out of pleasure, but out of strategy. To trick her body into feeling fuller. To stretch every bite across every second. She drank the broth last, letting it sit in her stomach like a small stone, heavy but helpful. There were no plates. Just wooden bowls. No silverware. Only fingers or wooden spoons. No napkins. No table to sit at. They sat on crates, the ground, or wherever they found space. And always, they shared. If someone was sick, they got the bigger portion. If someone had worked the hardest, they got the softest piece. If a neighbor was in need, they made room in their pot, even when theirs was already thin. Food was never just food. It was care. It was currency. It was peace. But behind every meal, even the small ones, lurked the quiet question. Will there be enough tomorrow? Because sometimes there wasn't. Spoiled grain. A spoiled cow. A storm that wiped out the root cellar. A rat that got into the flour. And just like that, a family meal turned into whispered math. How many days left? How much can we stretch? Who eats less, just in case? She never once expected a full belly. Even as a child, she had learned to say, "I'm full," before she really was, so her siblings could have a little more. It became habit. A kindness. A sacrifice so common, it no longer felt like one. She didn't eat for taste. She ate to move. She ate to work. She ate to stay upright long enough to survive another day. But even in the simplest foods, she found meaning. The bread reminded her of her mother, strong, heavy, plain, always there. The onions reminded her of spring, sharp, surprising, alive. The pottage reminded her of herself, a mix of whatever was left, boiled into something useful. And sometimes, when no one was watching, when the night was calm and the hunger less cruel, she let herself imagine. A sweet apple. A piece of cheese. A meal where she didn't have to count every bite. But those dreams would come later. Tonight she held her bowl. Shared a glance with her sister. Licked the last drop from her spoon. And for one moment, one quiet, flickering second, she felt full enough. She had known hunger. But famine was different. Hunger was a whisper in her belly. Famine was a scream across the entire village. It didn't happen suddenly. No. It crept in. First came the rumors. Whispers passed between neighbors. The rain's been too much. The roots are drowning. The wheat is blackened. She didn't understand it fully. Not the crops, not the soil. But she understood the looks her father gave her mother when they thought the children weren't watching. Then came the signs. The flour tin felt lighter. The pot stayed uncovered longer. The pottage was thinner than usual, and the bread harder, smaller. And then, one day, there was simply nothing left. She remembered the silence that day. Not dramatic. Just still. Her mother didn't call them for breakfast. Her father didn't speak. Her little brother cried, but softly, like even he knew the house was holding its breath. They boiled water, and drank that instead of stew. She told her sister it was soup. But they both knew it wasn't. Famine was not just about empty bowls, it was about the waiting. Waiting for help. Waiting for harvest. Waiting for a rabbit to fall into a trap, or for someone to share a miracle. She had heard of people eating bark, or roots, or clay. In her own home, they chewed leather scraps. Old belts. Hopes. Prayers. Days passed. Sometimes they slept longer just to forget they were hungry. Their bones felt hollow. Their joints stiff. Her body slowed, and so did her thoughts. But she couldn't stop moving. Even without food, she still had chores. Still had water to fetch. Still had goats to check, even if their ribs showed more each day. Still had a fire to keep alive, even when her own hands trembled too much to strike the flint. And her parents, they said nothing. But their silence said everything. Her father had always seemed strong, tall, steady, hard to read. But in famine, he looked older, smaller. As if the weight of being unable to feed his family had broken something in him that no field ever could. Her mother, once firm and fast with her hands, now sat more often, her stitching slower, her eyes distant. She rubbed her temples at night, whispering things too softly to hear. And still, they gave her the last piece of bread. Split an egg, when there was one, between 3 mouths. Pretended not to be hungry, so she wouldn't feel guilty. But she knew. You might think famine would destroy everything, but here's the truth. It revealed things. It revealed who shared, who helped, who disappeared, who took more than their share. The village changed. People grew quieter. Less laughter in the streets. More coughing. More empty chairs at meals that no longer felt like meals. And yet, even in all of this, she remembered kindness. A woman who left a small handful of dried peas on their doorstep. A neighbor who knocked just to say, "I'm hungry too." A stranger who traded a whole apple for a scrap of wool. She remembered once, during a particularly cold evening, her sister wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and saying, "Sleep. I'll keep the fire alive." And in that moment, the warmth in her heart almost overpowered the ache in her stomach. Because famine didn't just starve the body. It tested the soul. And hers? It bent. It cracked. It wept. But it didn't break. Eventually, the season passed. A rabbit was caught. A storm lifted. Barley grew green again. But famine never truly left. It stayed in her bones. in the way she never wasted a crumb, in the way her fingers still trembled when she saw an empty shelf, in the way she counted every mouth before eating, in the way she cherished the smell of anything cooking. Famine had taken something from her, but it also gave her something no one could name, a kind of quiet fire, a vow to always give, even when she had nothing, a reminder that even when the world runs dry, hearts can still overflow. She didn't have much. Most days, food was survival. But every once in a while, the world changed. There were festivals. Not often. A handful in the year, if that. But when they came, when they came, it was like breathing again after holding your breath for too long. It started days before, when whispers moved through the village. The baker sharpening his tools. The men collecting wood for bigger fires. The women smiling more, their hands quick with needle and thread, sewing even if the cloth was old. And in her home, a kind of quiet electricity filled the air. She could smell it before she saw it. The scent of something different cooking. Not barley, not onions, but something richer, heavier. Maybe eggs, boiled and cracked into the pot. Maybe meat, if the gods had smiled. Maybe apples simmering in a bit of wine, if someone had truly been blessed. The first time she tasted real meat, not dried bits or scraps boiled in broth, but a roasted leg of something, she nearly cried. Not because it was so good, but because it was so rare. She chewed slowly, letting the flavor linger on her tongue like a secret she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. Feast days meant color. Not in the food only, but in the faces. People laughed louder. Mothers braided their daughters' hair. The old men pulled out worn instruments. And even if the notes were off-key, no one minded. Music was a feast for the heart. She danced. She didn't do it well, but it didn't matter. Her bare feet slapped the ground. Her arms lifted. Her sister spun her in a circle until they both fell down laughing into the grass. Laughter like that felt holy, not because it was perfect, but because it was free. On those nights, the fire was big. The bowls were full. Even the dogs ate better. She watched her father smile, really smile, for the first time in weeks. She saw her mother sing quietly to herself while stirring a pot too big to lift alone. And maybe the best part, she wasn't hungry. Not that night. Not while the stew bubbled and the bread overflowed with steam. Not while someone handed her a slice of pie, real pie, with wild berries picked and mashed by children who giggled as they worked. She didn't rush. She didn't ration. She enjoyed. That night, her stomach was full. But more than that, so was her soul. You might think that such nights would make the regular days feel worse. That tasting joy would make the absence of it unbearable. But it didn't. Because these nights lit something inside her, something she carried into the gray days. They were reminders that even in a world of limits, there could still be moments. Moments of music. Moments of sweetness. Moments when the fire was for light, not just survival. She remembered how her sister curled into her afterward, whispering, "Do you think we'll always be poor?" And she didn't know how to answer. So she just said, "Not tonight." And truly, on feast nights, they weren't. Because for once, they had more than enough. More than bread. More than soup. More than survival. They had each other. They had music. They had warmth. And the stars above, for once, felt like they were shining just for them. She didn't choose her dress. She inherited it, passed down from her mother, or sister, or someone who had outgrown it, or outworn it, just enough for it to find a new home. It was made of wool. Not the soft kind. Not the cozy, modern kind. But coarse, thick, itchy wool. The kind that rubbed her skin raw when she first started wearing it. The kind that didn't breathe in the summer and trapped dampness in the rain. But it was warm, and it lasted, and that mattered. In the warmer months, she wore linen, woven tightly from flax, stiff until it softened with time and use. It was thinner than wool, lighter, but it still scratched, still clung when she sweated, still faded until it became the same gray-brown as the soil she worked in. Her dress was not cut for beauty. It was cut for work. Long skirts to protect her legs from the sun and from thorns. Sleeves to roll up in the fields or cover up in the wind. A bodice tied tight. Not for form, but to keep the fabric from catching or falling as she moved. And she wore it every day. Not one like it. Not one of several. The same one. Maybe two, if her family had been lucky that year. Maybe an apron to cover it. But most days, one dress. Washed in the same stream where they fetched water. Dried in the wind. Hung on the same line where they dried herbs and hopes. It was earth-toned, not by fashion, but by fate. Brown. Gray. Faded green. Dull ochre. Colors that didn't show stains easily. Colors that could be mended without dye. Colors that blended into the village, the trees, the mud. When she looked down at her clothes, she didn't feel pretty. She felt functional. Her hem was often wet, dragging through puddles. Her sleeves stained with broth or berry juice. Her collar frayed from years of being tugged tight. And when the wind blew, she felt it through every thread. But she didn't complain, because that dress was hers. It knew her better than anyone. It had grown with her, softened against her skin, worn down in all the same places her body had. And strangely, she began to love it. Not for how it looked, but for what it meant. It meant warmth on cold mornings. It meant modesty, dignity, something to pull tight when eyes wandered. It meant tradition, the same cut, the same stitch, the same folds her mother had taught her to press before marriage. Sometimes she wondered what it would be like to wear something soft, silky, bright, something that flowed instead of stuck. But those thoughts were fleeting, because when she moved through her world, bent over fields, sitting by the hearth, holding a child on her hip, that old, scratchy dress held her, like a second skin that didn't ask her to be anything more than what she was. It wasn't beautiful, but it was honest, and in a world where she was always expected to give and do and endure. That honesty, that constancy, it was the closest thing she had to comfort. Her dress had holes, tiny ones at first, no bigger than the edge of a fingernail. A tear from snagging on a bramble bush. A thread pulled loose from catching on a nail. A spot burned slightly where a coal had popped too close to her skirt while she fed the fire. But she didn't throw it away. She couldn't. There was nothing else. So she mended. With fingers already cracked from cold and work, she took up a needle each night and stitched life back into the fabric that wrapped around her every day. Not for style, not for beauty, but for survival. Each patch had a memory. The dark square under her arm, added when her dress tore while carrying firewood. The lighter one near her knee, sewn on after she slipped in the mud walking back from the stream. The cross-stitch across the neckline, placed by her mother years ago, when she first received the dress. She didn't always have thread that matched, so her repairs showed. Some girls might have been ashamed of that, but not her. She wore her mended clothes with pride, like armor, because every stitch was a refusal to let hardship ruin what she had, a refusal to let her body go cold, a refusal to let go of something just because it wasn't perfect anymore. And truthfully, nothing in her world was perfect. But that dress? It was hers. It carried her scent, her heat, her history, and she knew it like a friend. She knew exactly where the wool was thinning, knew where to tug gently, and where to pull tight, knew how to fold it just right to avoid the holes when she walked into church or stood beside a stranger. Even her apron, a simple wrap of cloth tied at her waist, was mended more times than she could count. The ties had been replaced with bits of string. The corners were patched with scraps from her father's old tunic. And still, it held. Sometimes, on quiet nights, she'd wash her dress herself, scrubbing gently against a rock by the stream. She'd watch the dirt wash away, swirl through the water like memory letting go. And when she hung it up to dry, she'd smooth it with her hands, as if, just for a moment, she was caring for herself. Because no one else asked. "Are you okay?" No one else asked. "Do you need rest?" But the mending? The washing? The soft pressing of cloth? That was her answer. "Yes, I am tired. Yes, I am worn. But I am still here." And there was pride in that. Not loud pride. Not the kind that shouts. But the kind that hums under your skin like a steady song. The kind that lets you walk through the village with your head held just a little higher, even when your sleeves are patched and your hem is uneven. Because it means you made it. You kept going. You endured. Even when the seams gave way. Even when the thread snapped. You picked up the needle. You began again. And in a world that often forgot her, that dress remembered. Most days, her clothes were plain. Most days, her world was colorless, brown earth, gray skies, dust-colored skirts. But not every day. There were moments, small ones, fleeting, but enough to remind her she was more than just a body made for labor. On feast days, or weddings, or spring festivals when the fields were green and the air smelled of life, she reached into a small bundle tucked in the corner of the hut, her treasures. A scrap of ribbon, worn, faded, frayed at the ends. But it was blue, once bright, now stormy, and it was hers. She didn't remember when it was given to her. Maybe from her grandmother. Maybe traded for a chore. Maybe found and claimed as her own. But it was sacred. She didn't have jewels. Didn't have perfume. But when she tied that ribbon around her braid, she felt beautiful. Just a sliver of softness in a world of roughness. A line of color against the muted fabric of her dress. A whisper of identity in a life that demanded only usefulness. And others noticed. Her sister might smile when she saw the ribbon. Her mother might nod, saying nothing but feeling everything. Even the village boys, the ones who never said much, looked a little longer on days when the ribbon danced behind her in the wind. On those days, she stood straighter, walked slower, not out of vanity, but because she felt seen. She would sometimes pick a flower, wild and crooked, and tuck it behind her ear. It wilted quickly, but she didn't mind. It wasn't meant to last. It was a moment, a breath of beauty. And when she looked at herself reflected faintly in the water by the stream, she didn't see dirt or fatigue. She saw herself. She was still a child, in her eyes at least. She still liked chasing chickens when no one was looking. Still sang softly while she stirred the pot. Still braided her hair tight and uneven, thinking maybe it looked pretty. But one morning, her mother said her name in a different tone. Her father didn't meet her eyes at supper. And later that week, she was told, not asked, that a man had spoken for her. She was getting married. 14, 15, maybe 16 if her family had waited. Still so young that her hands trembled when she washed them. Still unsure if she'd ever been loved, or if love even mattered in a world like hers. Her wedding dress was her regular one, cleaned and pressed. No white. No lace. Just a ribbon in her braid and trembling fingers wrapped around bread and salt. She didn't know the man well. Maybe he was a neighbor, a farmhand who'd always nodded politely. Maybe an older widower with no children, looking for company and help. Sometimes they were kind. Sometimes they were not. But no one asked her how she felt. Because marriage, for her, wasn't about happiness. It was about duty. About being given to someone who needed a woman to warm the bed, feed the goats, bear the children, stir the pot. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Tears were for things you could change, and this was already done. She packed what little she owned. A ribbon. A spoon. A small wooden comb. Said goodbye to her sisters. Kissed her mother's cheek. Watched her father walk a few steps behind her, silent, already letting go. And then she crossed the village line, from daughter to wife. It didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a crossing over. A silent passage. One world behind her. Another waiting ahead. And as she stepped into her new home, whatever it was, she realized something. She was expected to know everything. To cook like her mother. To clean like a wife of 20 years. To smile, even if her heart was heavy. But inside, she still felt like the girl who whispered songs to the sheep and dreamed of pie. Marriage came with no guide. No comfort. Just a bed she didn't know, a man she barely understood, and a silence so loud it rang in her chest. Yet even as fear settled into her bones, she lit the fire. She folded the blankets. She looked at the man and whispered, "I will try." Because in her world, trying was the first act of love. Even if love hadn't come yet. She didn't know him. Not truly. She had seen him, once or twice, from across the village. Maybe he helped repair a roof last winter. Maybe he sold eggs. Maybe she heard him cough in the cold mornings or pass by her family's hut with a nod. But knowing of someone is not the same as knowing them. And now, he was her husband. He sat across the hearth from her, quiet, wide-shouldered, older than she expected. His hands were rougher than her father's. His voice deeper. Not cruel, but not gentle either. Just silent. He didn't ask her much that first day. Where she wanted the firewood stacked. If she could cook stew. How many siblings she had. But not what she liked. Not what scared her. Not what made her laugh. She slept on the far side of the bed, facing the wall, pretending not to hear him breathing beside her. There were nights when she cried softly, face pressed into the straw. Not because he hurt her, but because everything had changed, and no one had asked her if she was ready. And he, The man across the hearth. He seemed lost too. Not cruel. Not violent. Just tired. Sometimes he brought her a piece of bread without asking. Sometimes he fixed the door when it creaked. Sometimes he stayed out late, working, or maybe just avoiding the same silence that echoed inside their hut. And slowly, something shifted. She began to understand his rhythms. How he stirred his food 3 times before eating. How he cleared his throat before speaking. How he always looked out the door before he entered, as if checking whether he was welcome. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't cold either. He was simply a man trying to live. And she? A girl trying to grow into a woman without falling apart. They shared meals, quietly. Shared chores. Shared weathered glances. Shared nights where either spoke, but both listened to the crackling fire like it had something more to say than they ever could. And once, only once, she made him laugh. It startled them both. She was peeling onions. He walked in, covered in dust, and she said something without thinking. Something about how he looked more like a scarecrow than a husband. And he laughed. Really laughed. Not long. Not loud. But enough to melt something. That night, when they laid in the same bed, he didn't face the wall. He faced her. And for the first time since she had arrived, she felt less alone. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something. And in her world, something was rare enough to hold on to. The first time she felt the ache, she was 17. She had only been married for a short while. Her hands still trembled when she cooked in a kitchen that wasn't her mother's. Her heart still skipped when her husband cleared his throat, unsure what kind of mood he was in. But that morning, something shifted inside her. It wasn't sharp. Not painful at first. Just a heaviness. A quiet fluttering low in her belly. A strange, sacred sort of knowing. She was going to be a mother. There were no tests. No doctors. Just instinct. And silence. And her mother's voice in her memory saying, "You'll know. Trust me, you'll know." And she did. But knowing didn't make it easier. She was scared. Not of being a mother, but of what might happen before she ever got to be one. Because in her world, childbirth was not a moment of joy. It was a gamble. A crossing between life and death. A door you walked through with hope in one hand and fear in the other, praying that you'd return. There were no hospitals. No midwives with training. No medicine. No pain relief. Just the women of the village. And her body. And whatever strength she had left. She labored on straw. In pain she didn't know a body could hold. Screaming, then whispering, then holding on to her sister's hand like it was the last rope keeping her anchored to the earth. Hours passed. Or maybe days. Time blurred into agony. She felt like she was splitting, shattering, and still, there was no turning back. And then silence. A cry. A cry not from her lips, but from the child. And the world shifted. She was still alive. The child, a boy, was alive too. She cried then. Not from pain, but from relief so deep it hurt in a different way. And as they placed the baby on her chest, she felt something new, something terrifying and beautiful all at once. Love. Not soft. Not poetic. But wild. Fierce. A love that said, "I will die for you if I must. I will survive for you if I can." And then it happened again. Another pregnancy. And another. Because in her world, a woman was expected to bear many children. Not all would live. Some slipped away before she even gave them names. Some died in her arms. Some faded slowly, without reason. And every time she gave birth, she walked that same narrow line. Between this life and the next. Between joy and mourning. Between creation and collapse. But still, she did it. Because even when her body ached, and her heart was tired, she held those children with a strength no one ever praised. They cried in the night. She was there. They needed warmth. She gave hers. They laughed, and she felt it in her soul. And as for the man, her husband, something shifted in him too. He watched her labor. Watched her bleed and breathe and bring life into a world that took more than it gave. He brought her water without asking. He kissed her hand when she fell asleep sitting up with the baby in her arms. He started saying her name with softness. And little by little, in the small quiet hours between diapers and stew and sleep, something gentle began to grow between them. Not passion, not poetry, but companionship. He let her rest when he could. She sewed his shirt when it tore. They touched hands by the fire. They shared laughter again, not often, but enough. And on one evening, long after the children had been put to bed, he looked at her and said simply, "You are the strongest person I know." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, something warm moved through her. Like light in a dark room. Love had not arrived like thunder. It had arrived like a slow sunrise. And though the pain, the fear, and the loss were all still there, so was he. So was she. So were their children. So was their fire. And in that flickering glow, she found something she didn't expect to ever have. Not peace, but partnership. She did not bathe often. Not because she didn't want to, but because in her world, water was work. Water had to be fetched. Carried in heavy buckets from the stream. Heated over fire. Poured by hand. Used sparingly. A bath was a luxury. Not the kind you see in paintings, with steam and oils and soft towels. Hers was a wooden tub, barely wide enough to sit in. The water cooled fast. The room was cold. And if she was lucky, she got to bathe alone. More often, the family used the same water, one after the other. By the time it was her turn, it was more ritual than cleansing. She scrubbed her skin with a rough cloth. Sometimes with ash. Sometimes with lye soap, if it was made that season. She used her hands, her nails, her determination, to clean what the world insisted on dirtying. And when she was done, she dried herself with whatever fabric was dry, an apron, a shift, the edge of a blanket, and returned to her clothes. Always the same dress. Always the same socks, washed and hung by the fire. Always the same shoes, if she had any. She did not smell like flowers. She smelled like soil, like smoke, like onions, like labor. But she wasn't ashamed of it. That scent? It was the scent of effort, of survival, of a girl who worked from sunrise to starlight and still found time to wipe her face with a damp cloth before sitting at the fire. When she bled, once a month, quietly, with no warning, she had no medicine, no soft cotton, no pills to ease the pain. She folded scraps of cloth, rinsed them in the stream, hid them under her bed or behind the fire to dry, away from eyes that never asked but always noticed. She didn't talk about it. Her mother hadn't. Her sister didn't. It was a silent sisterhood, carried in glances, in quiet understandings, in a shared strength that no one celebrated, but everyone relied on. There were no baths to soothe the cramps. No time to rest. She bled while she worked. She bled while she cooked. She bled while smiling at a child who would never know how much pain lived behind her eyes. But still, she endured. She kept herself clean, not with luxury, but with care. She brushed her hair even when it tangled. She cleaned her nails even when they cracked. She rinsed her face before bed, even if the water was cold enough to sting. Because cleanliness wasn't about beauty. It was about dignity. And in a world where nothing was promised, not warmth, not health, not even the next day, she found her power in the small ways she took care of herself. Not for praise, not for pride, but because it reminded her that even in filth, even in sweat, even in pain, she was still herself, and no amount of dirt could take that away. In her world, pain wasn't a surprise. It was a companion. She didn't wake up wondering if she would hurt that day. She woke up wondering where it would hurt. Her knees, maybe, swollen from kneeling by the fire. Her fingers, cracked open by the cold and the wash water. Her back, aching from lifting baskets, babies, and burdens no one saw. But that was just the beginning. Because in her world, there were no clinics. No healers with herbs on every street. No pills tucked in boxes with instructions. There were no instructions for her life. If she cut her hand while slicing onions, and the blade was dull, rusted, infection crept in quietly. If her foot blistered inside her only pair of shoes, and she ignored it, as she always did, the wound might fester. If she caught a fever, a chill, a cough too deep to ignore, there was no cure. No warm bed in a white room. No machines to whisper her heartbeat. No doctor to nod and say, "You'll be all right." Just a damp hut. A blanket that smelled of smoke. A bowl of water. And a mother or sister or husband wiping sweat from her brow, whispering prayers they weren't sure anyone heard. The illnesses didn't have names. Only symptoms. She's hot. She's shaking. She won't eat. She stopped speaking. And then silence. She had seen it before. A friend, fine in the morning, cold by night. A neighbor who limped 1 week and vanished the next. A baby whose breath came too fast, too shallow, then not at all. She had seen it. She had expected it. Because pain didn't ask for permission, and death didn't give warnings. Even childbirth, the most natural, sacred thing a woman could do, was dangerous. So many didn't survive it. So many bled too long. So many slipped away, whispering goodbyes between clenched teeth. And yet, she kept going. She bore the cuts, the fevers, the aches in her stomach that may have been hunger, or something worse. She learned to move slower when pain came, to breathe deeper, to hum under her breath, as if her own voice could drown out the fear. She learned to listen to her body, when to rest, when to push, when to simply endure. And she endured everything. Without medicine, without mercy, with nothing but cloth, fire, and the will to keep waking up. And sometimes, just sometimes, she healed. The fever broke. The wound closed. The breath returned. And when it did, she smiled. Not because she felt strong, but because she had walked through something no one saw, and came out the other side. And even when no one praised her, even when the pain stayed, she whispered to herself, "I made it." She didn't dream of growing old, not because she didn't want to, but because no one around her did. The idea of white hair and soft chairs and grandchildren on her lap was foreign. She didn't picture herself with wrinkled hands by a fireplace, telling stories of her youth, because most women she knew never made it that far. Life in her world was fast, brutal, beautiful, but brief. By the time she was 20, she had already seen friends buried, girls she had laughed with while fetching water, gone in childbirth, a sister who died of a fever, an aunt who slipped on ice and never woke up, a neighbor's baby who coughed all night, then fell silent. Death was not rare. It was not dramatic. It was simply part of the rhythm. And so, she lived with that knowledge in her bones. She brushed her hair knowing it might gray early, or not at all. She held her child knowing he might outlive her by decades, or by days. She kissed her husband goodnight with the quiet ache of knowing that any goodbye could be the last. Life expectancy wasn't a number to her. It was a whisper in the dark. It was a candle she protected with both hands, praying the wind wouldn't take it. But here's the truth. That knowledge, the awareness of her own fragility, didn't make her weaker. It made her fiercer. She laughed harder when she had the chance. She held her child closer. She thanked the sunrise like it was a personal miracle. She paused when she felt joy, because joy wasn't guaranteed. She knew her time might be short. So she made every second count in ways no one ever recorded. No one wrote poems about her. No artist painted her face. No books told her story. But she lived fully. Because she had to. She loved with her whole chest, even when it hurt. She worked with her whole body, even when it ached. She gave with her whole heart, even when it was breaking. And when she looked into the eyes of someone younger, her daughter, her sister, a child in the village, she didn't speak about death. She didn't share her fear. She just said, "Be kind. Be brave. Be alive while you can." And they listened, because they could see the strength in her silence, the fire in her tired eyes, the way she fought for every moment, even when the world never noticed. She didn't expect to grow old, but she didn't let that stop her from growing full of love, full of memory, full of strength. She didn't need a long life to leave behind a legacy. All she needed was a heart that never stopped beating, not just for survival, but for meaning. She did not have weekends. No days off. No holidays written in red on calendars. But she had moments. Rare, sudden, glowing moments when the village stirred from its weariness and became alive. Festivals. Not grand, not lavish, but full of noise, color, movement. Once or twice a year. Maybe for the harvest, maybe for the new moon, maybe just because the weather had finally softened, the people gathered. A fire was lit in the center of the village. Tables were pulled out. Bread was baked. Someone played a flute, or drummed on a barrel, or sang a song that had no name. And she danced. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but freely. With her bare feet on the earth and her ribbon tied tight in her braid, she spun with the other girls, laughing, breathless, eyes wide from the flicker of firelight. She forgot her chores, forgot her aching back, forgot the silence of her home. In that one golden hour, she was not a worker, not a wife, not a girl defined by what she could endure. She was joy. Moving, singing, smiling joy. The men clapped in rhythm. The elders nodded from their chairs. The children ran in circles, dizzy from the sugar, the noise, the possibility. And she closed her eyes and let the music carry her. She did not care if the sky was black, or if the wind was cold, or if tomorrow would bring only toil, because this moment belonged to her. And when the music slowed, and the stars blinked awake overhead, she sat by the fire with warm bread in her hand, smoke in her hair, and a peace in her chest so rare, she held her breath to keep it from escaping. It didn't last. The next morning, her hands would be raw again. The floors would need sweeping. The water would need fetching. But for one night, just one, she remembered what it was like to be alive without suffering. And that memory? It stayed with her. Through winters. Through grief. Through silence. Because even if joy was rare, it was real. And that was enough. She didn't have hobbies. Not the way we think of them. But she had rituals. Evening came slowly in the village, the sun dripping behind the hills, the sky brushed in amber and coal. And inside their small, smoky hut, as the chores wound down and the fire was stoked low, she claimed her favorite kind of time. The quiet kind. A stillness so deep that the only sounds were crackling wood, shifting cloth, and the soft murmur of stories, old, winding, half-true tales whispered from mother to daughter, sister to sister. This was her sanctuary, and in it she stitched. Embroidery wasn't a luxury in her world, it was a language, a form of expression when words failed. Her thread became her voice, her hands a translator of thoughts she dared not speak aloud. She didn't embroider to impress. She embroidered to feel human. The patterns were simple, loops, flowers, tiny birds. Sometimes she added a symbol only she understood. A curl of thread shaped like a moon, or a shape that reminded her of her sister's smile. Her fabric wasn't new. It was patched linen, or the hem of an old apron, or a corner of a pillow that no longer had shape. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the doing, the motion, the meditation. As her needle moved through the cloth, her mind settled. All the noise of the day, the crying child, the barking dog, the shouting over spilled milk, faded. All the aches in her back softened. And in that small moment, her soul unfolded like a flower in the dark. And around her, others sat too. Her mother rocking slowly in the corner. Her younger sister running her fingers through a braid. A neighbor's boy curling by the fire with a crust of bread. Sometimes they told stories. Not grand ones, but personal ones. Like the time the goat escaped and ended up in the church. Or when lightning split the old oak. Or the tale of the ghost who haunted the well and only appeared when someone sang. These stories weren't written down, but they were kept. In memory. In smiles. In shared glances. She would laugh, real, full laughter, over the same tales year after year. And every time the laughter felt new. Because this circle of light in a world of shadows was her safety. And the fire, low and warm, wasn't just heat. It was belonging. She didn't need anything else in those moments. Not more food. Not finer clothes. Not softer beds. She needed this. A needle. A thread. A story. A flicker of flame. And in those hours between dusk and sleep, she remembered that life, for all its harshness, still had beauty tucked inside the cracks. She didn't have much. Not coins, not jewels, not freedom. But she had them. The other girls. Some were sisters by blood, others by bond. The girls she fetched water with. The ones who helped lift heavy baskets. The ones who whispered secrets while shelling peas or hanging laundry. And those friendships? They were sacred. They weren't loud or dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no promises sealed with rings or gifts. Just a glance, a nudge, a shared smile in the middle of a hard day. They braided each other's hair, not for beauty, but for comfort. They traded scraps of ribbon or a better needle. They shared tips, how to soothe a crying baby, how to mend a hem faster, how to avoid the worst part of the muddy path to the stream. They laughed. They really laughed. Not because life was easy, but because sometimes laughter was the only rebellion they had. They told jokes during chores, sang while scrubbing pots, danced when no one was watching, and when one cried, really cried, they didn't ask, "What happened?" They just sat beside her, maybe reached for her hand, maybe offered a warm piece of bread, maybe just stayed silent, because silence held more than words ever could. They protected one another. When a man looked too long, when a burden felt too heavy, when a secret needed guarding, they knew each other's pain, each other's cycles, scars, fears. And even if the world never gave them safety, they gave it to each other. There was strength in that. In the way they kept one another upright. In the way they whispered hope in the dark. In the way they pulled joy from the thin threads of their lives and wove it into something stronger than sorrow. And when one of them left, married off, or sick, or gone too soon, the others remembered. They told her stories around the fire. They wore her favorite ribbon on feast day. They named their daughter after her. Because that's what love looked like for them. Not flowers, not letters, but presence. Showing up, holding space, being the anchor when everything else slipped away. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And in the shadows of a hard life, that was light enough to keep going. Her dreams were simple, not because she lacked imagination, but because in her world, dreaming too big could break your heart. So she dreamed small, of a warm bed in winter, of a loaf of bread that didn't run out before Thursday, of boots without holes, of waking up without pain in her back or hunger in her stomach. She dreamed of her child, full, laughing, clean, of her husband coming home from the fields without a limp, of her mother singing again, of quiet nights with no fever, no crying, no sudden knock at the door. Sometimes, her dreams were sounds, laughter in the kitchen, the soft splash of water in a clean basin, the rustle of hay in a roof that didn't leak. Sometimes, her dreams were touch, a hand on her shoulder after a hard day, a child's arms around her neck, the brush of her sister's ribbon against her cheek. She didn't dream of treasure. She dreamed of peace. Not perfect, just enough. Enough food to share. Enough hours of rest. Enough safety that she could close her eyes at night without bracing for something to go wrong. And when she let herself go further, just a little, she dreamed of comfort. A dress that wasn't patched. A fire that didn't smoke. A day where her hands didn't bleed. Not luxury, just relief. And even though the world around her told her not to hope too much, she still did. Because dreaming for her wasn't weakness, it was resistance. It was how she held on to her humanity in a life that tried to wear it down. She didn't speak these dreams aloud. Not always. Not even to herself, sometimes. But at night, when everyone was asleep, and the fire burned low, and her child was curled up beside her, she let herself imagine. And in that imagining, she was no longer just surviving. She was reaching. And that reaching, even if quiet, was beautiful. Somewhere, deep beneath the layers of dirt, duty, and exhaustion, she dreamed of more. Not more bread. Not more cloth. Not even more gold. But more life. She wouldn't speak these dreams aloud, not even to her closest friend. Because where she lived, dreaming big was dangerous. A girl was not meant to want more than her husband, her children, her field, and her faith. But still, in quiet corners of her mind, something stirred. She dreamed of being known, of someone listening, really listening, to her words. Not just whether she needed firewood or how long the stew should boil, but what she thought, what she feared, what she loved. She dreamed of learning, of reading symbols that lived in books she'd never touched, of hearing stories from lands she'd never seen, of knowing why the moon waxed and waned, or what made fireflies glow. Sometimes she stood at the edge of the village and stared at the hills, wondering what lay beyond them. She'd heard rumors of cities, oceans, palaces, forests so thick the sun couldn't get through. And something inside her ached, not because she hated her home, but because she wanted to see it all. She wanted to walk through a place where no one knew her name, where she could be someone new, not the baker's daughter or the blacksmith's wife, but herself, whoever that was. She didn't want to be a queen. She just wanted to matter, to feel, if only for a moment, that her soul was bigger than the space she'd been given. But then, the baby would cry, the wind would howl, the stew would boil over, and the dream would shrink, folding itself back into the small, quiet room in her heart where it always lived. Because dreaming that way came with risk. It meant wanting, and wanting in her world meant aching for something she might never have. But here's the secret. Even if she never spoke the dream, even if she never wrote it or named it or followed it down the road beyond the village, it still lived in her, in the way she looked at the stars, in the stories she told her children, in the songs she hummed while sewing, about faraway rivers and secret kingdoms. That dream of more gave her color in a gray world, and though no one saw it, it glowed. She didn't want everything. She wanted enough. Enough years. Enough strength. Enough peace to get through the next day. Her greatest hope wasn't freedom. It wasn't adventure. It wasn't even happiness in the way we speak of it today. It was survival. To wake up. To breathe without pain. To feed her children. To get through winter. She hoped for a roof that held through the storm. For hands that didn't tremble while she worked. For legs that could carry her to the stream and back. She hoped her child wouldn't cough too long. That the fever wouldn't come back. That there would be enough onions to last a month. And most of all, she hoped to see them grow. To watch her baby speak its first word. To see her daughter stand tall enough to reach the bread shelf. To hear her son laugh with missing teeth and muddy feet. She didn't hope for riches. She hoped for time. Because time in her world was never promised. Every woman she knew had lost someone. A child, a sister, a friend, a piece of herself. And yet, she hoped. Hope wasn't some glowing thing on a hill. It was a whisper under her breath as she stirred the pot. It was a quiet prayer spoken while folding cloth. It was a look she gave her child when tucking them into a straw bed. May I see you tomorrow? And sometimes, that hope was enough to keep her going. On days when her knees ached and the cold seeped through her bones. On nights when the wind howled and the baby wouldn't stop crying. When her hands bled from work. When no one said thank you. When she couldn't even cry. That hope lived inside her. Small. Flickering. But there. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't loud. But it was sacred. And if she could hold on to it, even just a little longer, then she had won. Because in a life that gave her so little, to survive was to triumph. To raise her children was to conquer. To still believe in tomorrow, even a hard one, was the greatest act of courage she knew. She didn't wear a crown, but she held weight. Not the weight of gold or jewels, but the weight of her family's hunger. The weight of the firewood on her back. The weight of her child's small hand inside hers. History never paused for her. While kings rode through triumph and towers fell in battle. While castles burned and borders shifted. She bent over a boiling pot. Rubbed cracked hands with ashen cloth. And whispered lullabies into straw pillows soaked with tears. She did not make history. She held it. She was the hands that turned the soil that fed the world. The arms that swaddled the next generation. The feet that walked roads no one bothered to name. She cried, often alone. She bled, without ceremony. She dreamed quietly, so no one would call her foolish. But every time she stood back up, every time she stitched a torn sleeve, every time she said, "Eat, I'm not hungry," even when she was, she proved that endurance is its own kind of royalty. She ruled no kingdom, but she ruled moments. The morning she gave birth and lived. The evening she traded half her bread for a neighbor's smile. The days she taught her daughter how to thread a needle, even with shaking fingers. No artist painted her hands, but if they had, they would have found stories in every line. Wrinkles from scrubbing, calluses from cutting, a scar here, a burn there, all earned, all real, all hers. She laughed, not often, but fully. The kind of laughter that escapes when you forget to be afraid. The kind of laughter that makes you feel like maybe, just maybe, you are still alive. And sometimes, late at night, she sang. Not loudly, not confidently, but like a bird remembering it still had a voice. A small hum, a soft tune, a secret gift to herself. And though her name was never written down, though no bard sang of her, though she was buried in a grave with no marker but the earth itself, she changed the world, because she raised a child who raised another. She kept a family warm through winter. She told stories that lit fires in young eyes. She taught tenderness to a generation raised on survival. And maybe, just maybe, someone, long after she was gone, stood at the fire one night and said, "My mother used to hum this," or, "My grandmother once told me," and in that moment, she was alive again, because the life she lived was not small. It was foundational, not loud, but steady, not famous, but unforgettable. if you know where to look. She may have died without praise, but she lived with purpose. And for all the palaces, armies, and kings we remember, it is women like her, unseen, unspoken, but unshakable, who truly held the world together.